Thank you for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Edward Saywell.
The warmest of welcomes to you all. We'll get to that in a minute. This great symphony of today, which is an eternal variation of the symphony of yesterday, a succession of melodies whose variety ever issues from the infinite. This complex hymn is called Color. Charles Baudelaire's words, taken from his famous review of the Paris Salon exhibition of 1846, encapsulates the myriad nature and the complex history of color. From the allure of gold to the purity of white, the evocative power of color has captured the imagination of entire civilizations, with perhaps just a handful of exceptions. This morning, you'll be thankful to know we're not going to be talking about color rules or color charts or color theories, formulas or recipes. But instead, what I hope will be a very enjoyable and extremely personal journey, a romp, as you might call it, through some of the most remarkable stories around just 4 colors, those of red, of gold, blue, and white. There's an almost bewildering number of tales that can be told about each of them, and I've picked just a few. And we'll hear this morning about how those colors possess great social, great cultural, and spiritual powers. And above all, how they cannot just dazzle visually, but truly, deeply inspire. In one of the most profoundly moving bodies of work that I know of, and I apologize this is a little blurry, Sophie Cowell's 1986 series of photographs called The Blind, the French artist asked about 24 people who were born blind to describe what their image of beauty is. Their answers were piercingly poignant, heart-rendingly poetic. And in Sophie Cowell's installation, for each individual, she took a photograph of the person, put the quote adjacent, and then took a photograph of exactly what their image of beauty is. And one of the most moving is this one. It's of a boy whose portrait hangs beside his quote and a photograph of a patch of grass. And the quote reads, "Green is beautiful. Every time I like something, I'm told it's green. Grass is green, trees, leaves, nature too. Without ever having seen the color, it is for him the encapsulation of beauty." And we'll see today just how colors can move an individual. They can also move entire societies. The latter perhaps most powerfully captured by the Albanian contemporary artist Anri Sala, whose video Dami I Colori, Pass Me the Colors, from 2003, recall the joyous, riotous colors of the Albanian capital of Tirana. Using a camera hoisted onto the back of a truck, Anri Sala literally drove around Tirana, panning along the facades of the walls, the facades and the roofs of the buildings of that city. A riot of joyous color instituted by the visionary mayor of the city, Ed Rama, as part of a massive regeneration scheme to escape more than 50 years of communist isolationism from the rest of the world, to add a little joy, a little color to a city that had long been deprived of it. When colors came out everywhere, a mood of change started transforming the spirit of the people, Rama said. They started to feel something they'd forgotten. Beauty was giving people a feeling of being protected. And although it may still be one of the poorest cities in Europe, it is undoubtedly now the richest in color. And yes, color has the power not just to move an individual or a society, but the entire world, to take our collective breath away. Here, the moment that billions of people came to know that our world was blue. The photograph, now known as Earthrise, is arguably one of the most influential images ever made, taken in 1968 by the crew of Apollo 8 from one of that craft's small windows. And so perhaps it is no coincidence that by far and away the most common answer to that question, asked from children's playgrounds on, "What is your favorite color?" is blue. Transcending national boundaries and cultures, more than 40% of people worldwide, myself, I have to admit among them, choose blue as their favorite. And the good news for all of us blue lovers here today is that apparently, according to the color gurus, we want a serene world and a calm life. But as we will also see, color is, and in fact always has been, big business too. And so for those of you who are still thinking about their spring wardrobes, courtesy of the Pantone Color Institute's color analysis for spring 2014, I want to let you know that in coming weeks, you should apparently, and I quote, be looking for a state of thoughtful, emotional, and artistic equilibrium. Although aren't we all? By pairing soft pastels and vivid colors. But hey, who are we really kidding? But who cannot be intoxicated by the heady range of colors that make up our world and have been utilized by artists for literally thousands of years? As a student, I remember the rapture of standing in front of these intensely colored powdered pigments, mesmerizingly vivid, revealing their identities through their peeling and aged typed labels, some handwritten. The pioneering collection to which these bottles belong was begun at the turn of the 20th century by Edward Forbes, a former director of the Fog Art Museum, not only to learn more about the rich histories of the pigments themselves, but so that he could study and recreate the actual techniques of the old masters, their methods. The collection continues to grow to this day and is still actively used in conservation. And the two works that perhaps had some of the most profound impact on my own interest and love of color and artist materials remain for me to this day among the most startling and the most mysterious and certainly the most precious of works. Tiny, literally no more than 3 inches high by about 2.5 inches wide, these magical little brown ink and white gouache drawings by the school of the great Italian Renaissance artist Fra Angelico never fail to take my breath away. The drawings of the crucifixion and of Pilate washing his hands are drawn on parchment with the most extraordinarily vibrant, even outrageous, magenta-colored ground layer. We have to ask the question, why? Was it practical? To create a tonal middle ground, to allow the artist to model both toward light and dark values? Certainly. Perhaps also, as speculated, the magenta layer was intended to be an affordable imitation of the precious Iglame glass-etched panels mounted in 15th century religious reliquaries. And yet, practical or not, they're nothing less than gem-like. Their wild, magenta-colored ground continuing to surprise and delight nearly 600 years after their creation. But today, over the course of our morning, our stories will range across just 4 of those colors: the red, the gold, the blue, and white I've mentioned. And through them, and the cultures they touched, will bring to life how they changed, in many instances, not just the course of art history, but of history itself. I'm so fortunate to be red. I'm fiery. I am strong. I know men take notice of me and that I cannot be resisted. How wonderful it is to cover a surface that awaits me with my own victorious being. Wherever I'm spread, I see eyes shine, passions increase, eyebrows rise, and heartbeats quicken. A passage from the Turkish author and Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk's 1998 novel, My Name is Red. Red has a rich and complex history, the color of blood. It has been considered by many cultures the most important of colors, associated with life-giving and protective powers. In the Western world, at least, red invokes life and it invokes death, the sacred and the profane, martyrs and demons. The cave painters of Lascaux, France, used red earth pigments to highlight the black charcoal figures of animals and humans as early as the 2nd millennium BC. It doesn't look much, but at the same time, Egyptians saturated special linen burial cloths with deep orange-red hematite, which would act as the outermost wrapping of their mummies. This particular example in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum has inscribed remarkably along its edge, "Temple linen to protect," possibly evoking the religious belief in the protective power of red, and also reminiscent of Osiris, Egyptian god of the afterlife, who is referred to as the Lord of the Red Cloth. The red bed linens of Jan van Eyck's 1434 painting, the Arnolfini portrait. The newlywed couple stand in front of them, and those red linens are associated not just with passion and with love, but the red bedclothes at that time were used to ward off the so-called red illnesses, such as fevers, rashes, and, perhaps most appropriately here, miscarriages. It is also the color of violence and of anger, of red blood, of drama and of ferocity. In Caravaggio's highly dramatic Judith beheading Holofernes from 1598 to 99, the magnificent, heavy, rich red drapes, crimson red, crown the act of gory murder and mirror the blood that pours and spurts from the neck of Holofernes' writhing body. The early iconography of the Mary Magdalene also usually portrays her in red, a symbol of her being a worldly woman, a scarlet. In Giovanni Bellini's soft, hazy, heart-stoppingly beautiful Virgin and Child, St. Catherine is shown on the left and Mary Magdalene on the right. Their faces emerge from the inky background, Mary Magdalene dressed in red, her hair red, and her hair down, like the prostitute that legend says she was. And in the early 20th century, 1911 to be exact, is there a more exuberant painting taking delight in the pleasures of red than Matisse's Red Studio? Where I got the color red, to be sure, I just don't know, Matisse remarked. I find that all these things only become what they are to me when I see them together with the color red. Wherein red fabrics indicated strength, prestige, and power. Under sumptuary laws in early modern Europe, red was reserved for royal families and the highest of nobilities. Indeed, the red robes of kings, of nobles, of clergy, of judges, even executioners, signaled their power over life and over death. And can there be any more brilliant example of capturing the luscious texture of those robes than Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X? You literally can feel the fabric. In Asia, especially China, red has additional associations and connotations with luck and with joy, stemming from the traditional theory of the 5 elements, in which red corresponds with the element of fire. They may not be as luxuriant as Velázquez's robes, but in Chinese society, on special occasions, and the brides embracing their cultural roots, traditional wedding gowns are often red, and monetary gifts are often given in red envelopes. And in today's art market, well, here's a test. Connect the dots between 3 of the top-selling lots in an auction in London earlier this year. Gerhard Richter's Wand Wall, which sold for a world record price for the artist of $29 million. Alberto Burri's Rosso Plastica from 1963. And Andy Warhol's 1973 portrait of Chairman Mao. Common between all 3, red. A coincidence? Apparently not. Recent headlines in the international press have read, "Paint it red, the secret reason for a painting's high price," and "How red boosts a painting's value." Auction house experts have noted that the more red a painting flaunts, the higher the price it is likely to fetch. And those same experts will tell you that the current trend of red art fetching higher prices is due to those very cultural connotations of red that I just spoke of, notably as a symbol of luck and notably among the Chinese. And of course, China today is one of the most burgeoning of contemporary art markets. As Cheyenne Westfall, chairman of contemporary art at Sotheby's, noted recently, the power of red is extraordinary. Red is the most emotive color in art. It's powerful, it's lucky in many nations. We've often seen a price correlation in that red paintings have performed better than other works. And if you want an example of truly savvy marketing by Sotheby's, Cy Twombly's Untitled Rome 1964, which also sold at the same auction a couple of months ago for an almost world record price of the artist of $20 million, was, yes, and I quote, particularly desirable for being the most read of all his works. The choice of reds that an artist has had and continues to have today, red ochres, vermilions, red lakes, can be mesmerizing. And this wonderful slide gives you an idea of a range of just one particular source of red when various modifiers are added. But it's a very special source of red, and it perhaps has the greatest and most wonderful story behind it. And it's a story that begins with a tiny insect, the cochineal, that lives and feeds on the nopal, or the prickly pear cactus, a little critter that literally colored the world red. The cochineal was the primary red dye used in the ancient Americas to create brilliant crimson red. On the left, the insect still alive, and on the right, when dried. These pages from a 16th century manuscript, and secondly, a 17th century one, document the process of literally harvesting the bugs off the cacti. The brilliant red cochineal comes from crushing the tiny little insects. About a quarter of the insect's body weight is made from carminic acid, an acid which is actually intended to ward off predators. And it is this acid that effectively creates the blood-red cochineal extract. And with the coming of the Spanish in the early 16th century and the age of global sea trade, it also became the most sought-after red color in the world. It was widely used as the source of dyes for red clothing. This elaborate tunic, woven in Peru, for example, sometime between the 12th and the 15th centuries, is decorated with abstract feline creatures and figures sporting crescent headdresses. Soon, Amsterdam and Antwerp became major trading hubs for the dye, and Flemish dyers became renowned for their experience in cochineal dyeing, as evidenced by this magnificent Flemish tapestry from the mid-16th century in which cochineal was used. Inevitably, the cacti, along with the bugs, were smuggled out of Mexico by enterprising foreign travelers. And after the Mexican War of Independence, the country lost its monopoly of the cochineal trade to other countries, including Guatemala and the Canary Islands. But for years, it was a mainstay of the Spanish Empire's economy, second only to silver. Pre-Columbian weavers used cochineal, so did El Greco, Tintoretto, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh. Navajo weavers of the 18th and 19th century followed suit, as did Spanish design icon Mariano Fortuny. Its popularity was only eclipsed in the late 19th century with the increased availability of synthetic dyes, but not before Edward Muybridge captured this image of workers gathering cochineal in Antigua. But if one artist above all others were to become known for their brooding reds, their dark reds, it is Mark Rothko. So much so that he was the subject of a recent Tony-winning play called Red. A pioneer of New York painting in the 1950s, the play Red documents what is perhaps one of the most infamous and famous bodies of Rothko's work, the series of murals that were commissioned to hang in the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building on Madison Avenue in New York, and which now are part of Tate Modern's collection. The history of the commission remains, even to this day, clouded in uncertainty. What were his true motivations and intentions in taking the commission, given he quite openly despised the wealthy who could afford to eat there? He even joked that he wanted to create an environment that would be off-putting for those actually eating. The progress of his work, the final form of the murals, the reason for the project's eventual abandonment remain contradictory and uncertain. But the works that are left with us are collectively one of his most transcendent, brooding, poignant, and powerful bodies of work. They are truly a manifestation of Rothko's journey away from the fiery, hot, luminous palette of his earlier works, floating fields of softly edged colours, towards the deeper, the darker reds, the maroons, the browns and blacks evident in the paintings of his later years. And perhaps more than any other artist, this shift in colour sensibility from those virulently vibrant colours to this dark, brooding maroon has been interpreted as a reflection of Rothko's own increasingly dark state of mind and soul, one that was to lead to his suicide in 1970. But shortly after the Seagram mural project, Rothko also took on a commission for the Holyoke Center just across the river at Harvard. The 5 works were donated by Rothko to the university, and they shared the form of the open rectangles of the earlier Seagram murals and a similar palette. But to show them to you today underlines a tragic history and a devastating lesson in how the once rich maroon-colored canvases, remember this from the Seagram work from just a few years prior, are now but a sad, faded, and much changed reflection of what they had been. What was once deep red crimson is now a faded grey, green-blue, their appearance completely washed out. Rothko was, in his own words, divorced from the conventions of 1,000 years of painting. And although the present condition of the Harvard murals can, sadly, be tied and blamed on many, critical was the artist's own use of new, untested materials. Technical analysis of the original crimson pigments that have survived, and quite literally on some of these canvases, it is limited to the pigment that lies underneath the staples on the tacking margin along the very sides of the canvases, protected from the light, have revealed how incredibly fugitive and unstable the red pigments were. A key component of his red paint was the highly unstable lithol red, one of the key red pigments in printing, but highly volatile and not light-fast at all. And the problem in the context of the Holyoke Center? Well, they were installed in a dining room with floor-to-ceiling glass windows on the top floor in the penthouse. The deterioration of the canvases was incredibly rapid, and within just a few years, concern was raised over their fading. I asked him about the paint he used. A conservator at the Fog reported on her conversation with Rothko to the director of the Fog, Agnes Mongan, in 1969. He said it was mostly oil, and that when he ran out of paint, he had gone downstairs to the Woolworths and bought more. He didn't know what kind it was. In the end, the murals became so fragile and so decayed, there was no choice but to remove them and roll them safely for storage. But why, might you ask, have they actually faded to such an extraordinarily strange color? No longer the crimson, but a blue-gray ghost. Well, in answer, the lithol red was mixed by Rothko with a synthetic ultramarine, a blue, to make the crimson color, and the blue has proven far more stable and light-fast. And can we ever see these works again as anything more than a telling history of decay, of a sad story of dramatic alterations in color and tonal balance? And perhaps fascinatingly, the answer is yes. A team of conservators at Harvard Center for the Technical Study of Modern Art and Strauss Center for Conservation, with help from MIT's Media Lab and Switzerland's University of Basel's Imaging and Media Lab, have developed in the last few years a technique to restore the paintings in a remarkably unorthodox way without laying a single paintbrush on them. I'm afraid I don't have any photographs, so you have to imagine this process, but my hope is we'll all see the magic soon enough. First, the conservators took what are now the faded color ectochrome photographs of the murals when they were first installed, and they digitally enhanced those photographs by referencing colors from an uninstalled 6th panel of the series. With the restored photographs in hand, the conservation staff then scanned all the information into a computer, and through custom-made software, literally pixel by pixel, they began to build up on the screen a rendering for each of the Harvard paintings that is believed to be as close to the original crimson and to the original tonal balances for each of the canvases as possible. And then using a digital projector as a light source, what they call a compensation image can be projected onto each of the canvases, augmenting the now missing colors and effectively returning them with nothing but highly calibrated and precise colored lights back to where and what they had looked like more than half a century ago in 1963. The allure of gold, a noble metal, has captured the human imagination throughout history. Gold was probably one of the very first metals to be discovered, though it has proven remarkably scarce. And despite its somewhat useless qualities, it is actually incredibly soft and weak. It's hopeless for weapons, for example. It quickly and very early on became a symbol of power, both spiritual and secular, as this ancient Inca mask overwhelmingly demonstrates. Today, gold remains the most enduring form of wealth. Its power first realized as early as 3600 BC, when it was first smelted by the Egyptians, and it is valued by almost all societies today and still has an enduring fascination for us all. The desire for gold is an essential part of human history. There are frequent mentions of the valuable metal in ancient Greek and Roman texts, as well as the Old Testament. In his allegory of the metals in the Republic, written by Plato in the 5th century BC, the philosopher proposed that social order be instilled by teaching people a myth, that God made the guardians of society from gold, the auxiliaries from silver, and the majority from copper. Gold was literally the apex of a culture, and this attitude continues down to our own time. The human desire for gold has even long been steeped in elements of magic and myth. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists combining practical chemistry with theological contemplation in an attempt to create the ever-elusive philosopher's stone, a magical entity that could change base metal into gold. Here, Joseph Wright of Derby's painting of such an attempt. But why do we cherish gold so much? Its value is essentially its color, its unique, bewitching yellow, one that never stops shining. The Greek lyric poet Pindar, in one of his Olympian odes, noted, "But gold shines like fire blazing in the night, supreme of lordly wealth." Its color is that of the sun, and in prehistoric cultures all around the world, the sun was the most powerful of divinities, the bringer of light and of warmth to the world. Even in 1679, the London goldsmith William Badcock noted, and I quote, "The secret influence of the sun is very powerful in the generating of gold." Ancient peoples didn't just think gold looked like the sun, they believed it was materially the same thing. Perhaps ironically, though, much of ancient gold has actually been discovered below the earth, in graves, consigned. And the description of gold in the Old English epic poem Beowulf, written in Anglo-Saxon England, is fitting. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. What was befitting of status on earth was equally acceptable to the gods. Few civilizations had a cult of the dead, though, as powerful and as lustrous as that of ancient Egypt. For the ancient Egyptians, gold, with its untarnishing luster and heft of weight, represented the afterlife. The burial chambers of the pharaohs became nothing less than magnificent treasuries, filled with all things imaginable, such as this incredible throne. For in their imagination, gold was literally the flesh, the skin of the gods. The power of the pharaoh over the people was based on absolute authority as ruler, as priest, and as the deity. The complex, elaborate ritual of the dead completed the transformation of his earthly body into an everlasting divine being. And the lavish use of gold was based on the belief that only this purest of metals was a true symbol of the divine body. By covering yourself in this immortal substance, you yourself would become immortal. One of the greatest sensations in the cultural history of gold, and frankly of archaeology and art history, period, was the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter. Dating from the 18th dynasty, 1334 to 1325 BC, Tutankhamun's chambers contained more than 5,000 pieces of jewelry, furniture, vessels, statues, and more. And most spectacular was, of course, the embossed mask of the young pharaoh, which covered his head and chest. 21¼ inches high, it is made of sheet gold with inlaid precious stones and colored glass paste, with the outlines of the eyes and the brows in lapis lazuli. The symbolic gold of the Sun King is thus aligned with the luminous blue of the gold of the Nile. Given Tutankhamun was one of the youngest of the pharaohs, arguably one of the least significant, we can only dream and imagine what the tombs of the greatest and most powerful pharaohs had contained. In the Christian era, instead of immortality, gold represented divine light, and gold became a glittering bastion of Christianity. Early church artists used gold not because it was expensive, but simply because it looked miraculous. In the great Byzantine churches of the 6th century, such as the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built between 1532 and 1537, gold mosaics became the dominant medium of both decoration and depiction. However, instead of stones that had been split and simply hewn into small pieces, the artisans used squares of gold and colored glass to create mosaics of supreme perfection. The gold tesserae were made by applying gold leaf to sheets of glass, and then the gold foil was then covered with another layer of colorless glass. And this sandwich of glass, gold, and glass was then heated and cooled and cut into small squares that could be pressed into mortar. The resulting luminosity, breathtakingly captured by John Sinner Sargent in his painting of 1891, is one in which the building simply glows. And how can I talk about gold in art without at least showing two of the most remarkable 20th century examples of the delight and of the revelry that the luster of gold can give? Gustav Klimt's remarkable gilded paintings. A local celebrity during his lifetime, the Viennese artist is now nothing less than a phenomenon, an international sensation of our own time. His golden works are tourist attractions like no others. They're on keychains, coasters, napkins, fridge magnets, almost any surface you can imagine. But of course, they are also among the most prized and the most valued of works, catching sensational prices and matching headlines in the news. The son of a goldsmith, he was trained as an architectural painter. And in a very nice resonance to what we have just seen, he was deeply inspired by the mosaics of Venice and in particular Ravenna, in which this mosaic of the Empress Theodora had a lasting impression upon him. His training and his travels fostered an essentially decorative eye, which informed the artist's appropriately so-called golden period in the first decade of the 20th century. And in works such as the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, or perhaps most famously, The Kiss, he created icon-like paintings of femme fatales. Space melts, objects float, abstraction meets sensual pleasure. But the magical allure of gold as an artistic medium has not lost its relevance within contemporary art practice. Artists like Richard Wright have used gold as a conceptual tool to achieve the most fragile moments. Wright intervenes in architectural spaces, oftentimes corners, hidden ceilings, cornices, to create very subtle, very quiet works of intricate pattern. At Tate Britain, where he was to go on to win the Turner Prize a few years back, he filled a wall with symmetrical abstract gold leaf designs that look, in fact, like a giant gold ink block in a Rorschach test. It was frankly mesmerizing. Shimmering in the light, it actually had almost a mirage-like quality. In raking light, it would become incredibly strong, and then it would almost disappear. He worked almost like an old master painter, first creating the drawing on a sheet of paper, which he would then prick through using a pin along the outlines of the design, and then, placing the paper against the wall, would rub chalk through those holes to actually create the design on the wall. And then at that point, applied a glue size, a relatively weak glue, before finally applying sheet by tiny sheet the gold leaf directly onto the wall. It was a work of dazzling, incandescent beauty, taking more than 2 weeks to complete. And I used the past tense very purposefully, because of course at the end of the exhibition, it was simply whitewashed over. Of all colors, blue is perhaps the one that always surrounds us in one way or another. From the oceans to the sky, it has always captured our imaginations. And yet, strangely, it was also one of the very last colors to actually be named. In fact, as strange as it may seem, at one point blue hardly existed in the history of Western art. It's nowhere to be seen in ancient cave paintings. For the ancient Greeks, the sea was described as green or wine dark. It makes rare appearances in Roman wall paintings, and it played very little role in ceremonial rituals. In fact, status-wise, it was quite the opposite in some cultures. In India, for example, indigo, a key dye for clothing, it was the emblematic color of the lowest caste, the Sudra, the untouchables. And in Bengal, indigo has a bitter and violent history with the Indigo Revolt, an uprising of peasants against British oppression. But our story of blue this morning begins here in Venice. 1,000 years ago, when this stone first arrived by the hands of Arab tradesmen on European shores, lapis lazuli. Rare and precious, lapis was mined in Afghanistan, and for artists it rapidly became the most beautiful and the most expensive color of their palette. They called it ultramarinus, literally in translation, coming from beyond the sea. The process of taking a stone such as this and creating the powdered pigment of ultramarine was, as Giannino Cennini in his Il Libro dell'Arte from 1390, literally a how-to-do handbook for artists filled with invaluable information for artists of the time, was fastidious and laborious. As Giannino Cennini documented, ultramarine blue is a color illustrious, beautiful, and most perfect, beyond all other colors. And let some of that color, combined with gold, shine forth in every object. He goes on in tremendous detail how to grind the stone, perhaps more detail than any other pigment that he describes. And it was a process that took not just days, but literally weeks, slowly grinding it to a fine blue dust. Giannino Cennini recommended the task be undertaken by women. And know that making it is an occupation for pretty girls rather than for men, that they are always at home and reliable, and they have more dainty hands. He goes on to warn, though, without explanation, just beware of old women. As the rock became ground to a fine blue dust, it was encased in beeswax, pine resin, and gum arabic to purge it of impurities, heated, melted, strained time and time again. And perhaps what is most amazing about all of this, about this care, this attention, this detail, was that it was just to make a color, to make something so beautiful, so revelatory, that blue began to blossom in ways that hitherto had been unimaginable. From color forgotten and unnamed to arguably some of the most extraordinary artistic achievements of human history. And arguably, one of the most original and utterly brilliant examples of that occurred in a very tiny chapel in the university town of Padua. Within this austere, nondescript building, the Scrovegni Chapel, Giotto created nothing less than a masterpiece. It's a word that is sometimes overused, masterpiece, often overused, and yet in this instance it is uncontestable. For Giotto remains to this day arguably one of the greatest, most influential artists, and the works within these walls, frankly jaw-dropping creations of Western culture. As you enter the humble building, you are surrounded by the life of Christ and of the Virgin in all of their glory. And although the paintings are dramatic, lifelike, oftentimes regarded as the very beginnings of the Italian Renaissance, like nothing seen before, what is above your head is perhaps Giotto's most striking invention of all. For across the deep vault of the ceiling is the most beautiful, the most serene, the most brilliant blue, dusted with hundreds of gold stars. It is not a sky, it is heaven. And this is how Giotto in 1305 imagined the eternal world to be. And for Giotto, heaven is blue, ultramarine blue. And there, looking down upon us, is the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and other prophets. In one fell swoop, Giotto turned blue into the most powerful, the most beautiful, and the most sacred color of them all, the color literally of paradise itself. Rapidly, sumptuary laws intended to regulate and permit consumption even controlled who could wear blue and the amount of pigments that artists could buy. Ultramarine became even more expensive and even more precious than gold. And it seemed that only one person could always be robed in blue, the Mother of God herself, the Virgin Mary, depicted here in Jacopo Ticcioni's Ascension of about 1370. Fascinatingly, expenditure accounts survive for this particular painting. The ledgers tell us that 3 different grades of ultramarine were used, one costing 11 soldi, one costing 8.5, and one costing 2 soldi an ounce. The Virgin Mary can be seen at the back of the circle of the apostles, and her blue robe is notably darker than that of the apostle at front right, or even the sleeve of St. Peter immediately next to her. The reason? The ultramarine used to paint the Virgin's robe would have been the most expensive, the most precious, thus demonstrating the respect that was due to her. Later examples, we know that oftentimes artists would use the ultramarine for just the Virgin's robe and cheaper blue pigments, such as azurite, for the prophets. Venice, located in the north of Italy, but on the sea, able to trade across the Mediterranean and across the Alps to Germany, became the center of the pigment trade, and its artists simply had more access to colors. It's perhaps no surprise then, but it was to be one of Venice's greatest painters, Titian, for whom blue became such a passion, an obsession. A passion for whom, in the Pesaro altarpiece of 1519, the Virgin is literally shifted from the center of the painting to one side, and instead the heart of the painting is this rich swathe of ultramarine blue clothing St. Peter. And is there any richer, more luscious example of it than Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne of 1520? Almost half of the painting is blue. It must have cost Titian a fortune. The cloak, the dress, the mountains, and of course the sky. Conventions were blown away. Titian liberated the blue from the shackles and control of the church. Such love and obsession with blue was perhaps not found again until Yves Klein in the 20th century. IKB 79 is one of nearly 200 monochrome paintings Yves Klein made over his career. He began making monochromes in 1947, considering them to be a way of rejecting the idea of representation in painting. And the letters IKB stand for International Klein Blue, a distinctive ultramarine which Klein registered as a trademark color in 1957. He invented the color with the assistance of Edouard Adam, a Parisian paint dealer, and what he sought to capture in this color was the infinite blue of the sky and of the sea. He sought a blue without the traditional oil binder, which could impact detrimentally the intensity of the original pigment. And Adams achieved the luminescence that Klein sought by inventing a secret colorless ingredient, cryptically called the medium. It was, in short, a blue revolution. The announcement card for his one-man exhibition at the Galleria Apollinaire in Milan in 1957 described IKB as, and I quote, a blue in itself, disengaged from all functional justification. The works are deceptively simple, involving, in fact, a laborious process of preparation in order to maximize the incandescence of IKB. First, the canvas or cotton scrim was stretched over a wooden backing, and the canvas was then treated with a milk protein called casein. This assisted the adherence of the paint, rolled as perfectly as Klein could do over the surface, creating a rich, velvety texture and unusual appearance of depth. Perfect blue. The production of the monochrome paintings was probably conceived by Klein as both a spiritual and clearly marketable activity. His 1957 exhibition in Milan contained a series of 11 ostensibly identical blue monochromes, but each with a different price, which he claimed reflected their different spirits. As he explained, each blue world of each painting, although the same blue and treated in the same way, presents a completely different essence and atmosphere. When we think of white in art, we probably think of the pure forms of antique sculpture. The English essayist and critic William Hazlitt gazed on the white marble sculptures of antiquity and thought them cold. The finest statue in the world can only resemble a man turned to stone, he wrote in 1824. Sculpture, though not proper to express health or life or motion, accords admirably with the repose of the tomb. Unaware that ancient sculpture was anything but, the greatest sculptors of our time, Michelangelo or Canova, for example, created uncolored sculptures, pure and unadorned in their blazing white marble. In the 18th century, the German art historian and antiquarian J.J. Winkelmann decreed that whiteness was the secret to the beauty of classical statuary. White was the color of reason. Among the most famous Greek marbles are those, of course, removed from the Acropolis by Lord Elgin in 1801, the so-called Elgin marbles. Their history since that day has, as I'm sure you all know, been fraught. And today, we're not concerned about their repatriation or their legalities, but just how white is white. In 1857, Michael Faraday, the great British 19th century scientist, was consulted on the state of the marbles, increasingly dust-ridden and soot-covered, not only from the pollution of the city of London itself, but from the museum's own heating stoves and far from perfect ventilation. The examination has made me despair, Faraday wrote, of the possibility of presenting the marbles in the British Museum in that state of whiteness which they originally possessed. The sculptures had undergone periodic washing since their removal from the Acropolis in 1801, but in the 1930s, what has been called a disaster was to strike. At that time, Lord Joseph Devine, perhaps the most famous art dealer of our times, instrumental in building not only the Gardner, but also the Frick collections, became all too interested in the color of the marble, in readiness for the opening of his namesake gallery, in which the sculptures are still exhibited today. The Earl of Crawford, a then trustee of the British Museum, recalled the situation in his diary. Devine lectured and harangued us and talked the most hopeless nonsense about cleaning old works of art. I suppose he has destroyed more old masters by over-cleaning than anybody else in the world. And now he told us that all the old marbles should be thoroughly cleaned, so thoroughly that he would dip them into acid. Fancy, we listened patiently to these boastful follies. But cleaned they were in a campaign orchestrated by Devine himself in preparation for the reinstallation of the marbles in the new gallery he had funded. Except, instead of washing and dusting, the team of masons, and I underline that word mason, who were contracted to undertake the cleaning of these sculptures, used these, copper chisels and wire brushes. The marble, which over time had gained its natural patina and hue of the color of honey, was literally scraped and scraped until white. The long-running saga of the marbles had taken yet another twist, the extent of the damage one that for decades was largely kept a secret, and today it still remains a point of tremendous controversy. As the Archbishop of Canterbury, another trustee of the British Museum, wrote to the director in February of 1939, I am sure you will agree with me that it would be a mistake to dwell too fully in any public statement upon the extent of the mischief which was done, even though you and I may feel it was very serious. Thankfully, when the director realized what had been happening, he put a stop to it immediately. Although evidence had begun to surface, quite literally, from excavations in the early 19th century, that ancient sculptures were in fact far from unadorned, and not the pristine, brilliant white that so many, including Devine and Winkelmann, had wanted and chose to ignore. His sole aim was simply to make them as white as possible. If only they had seen this. Today, it is recognized that almost all ancient Greek marble sculpture was painted to one extent or another. And in 2003, a groundbreaking exhibition, Gods in Color, opened in Munich. And some of you may have seen it when it traveled here to the Sackler Museum at Harvard. It presented a number of reconstructions based on the analysis of the original sculptures and on scientific analysis of the traces of pigment that remain on them. And by placing what today are colorless sculptures under ultraviolet light, the ghosts of the patterns of the now vanished paint layers were revealed, allowing reconstructions such as this grave stele. And you can see here that this is what survives today. This is the painted reconstruction, and this is the infrared image. And you can see how in infrared the painted marks, but the figures, the graphic marks, the curlicues, all begin to magically appear. Here, the Alexander sarcophagus, one of the greatest treasures of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, among the most important and certainly one of the best conditioned classical antiquities ever discovered, totally intact. Made around 320 BC, when found it bore traces of the strident reds, yellows, and other colors it once wore. And the effects in color are remarkable after the scientific analysis allowed this reconstruction. On one of the short sides, a Persian holds his shield up over his head, and an audience scene at the court of Persia can be seen painted in the finest detail on the inside of the shield. Perhaps even more remarkable are the pediment figures from the Athea temple, which are now shown here in this photograph in Munich. During the excavations in the early 19th century, it was clear that the sculptures bore remnants of color. If we take the figure of Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam, as an example, in reconstruction, his bow tightened reveals the extraordinary geometric patterns and the rich decoration that adorned the figure. The splendid costume is nothing less than breathtaking, as is the overall reconstruction of the pediment. But let us now turn from image to support, by which I mean the surface that the artist will use to create their work. Usually they are faced with a blank canvas or a blank sheet of paper, a white one. But any support used for a drawing is far more than a simple surface to draw upon. It's an absolutely integral part of any drawing, its subtleties and its qualities of color, of texture, and of tone, able to assert a commanding presence alongside the actual image. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, perhaps more than any other old master draftsman, used his white drawing papers to literally create light from within the sheet. And a comparison between Tiepolo's rest on the flight into Egypt and Jean-Baptiste Greuze's seated female nude reveals the extraordinary difference in visual effect that papers of different hue and texture can produce. In the Tiepolo, the brilliant white paper is as much a part of the visual effect of the image as the ink on the paper's surface. By juxtaposing shadow created from ink wash with areas of paper untouched by ink, Tiepolo enhances the natural luminosity of the pristine white paper, exploiting it to imitate the effect of dazzling light. For his seated female nude, however, Tiepolo's contemporary Greuze chose a rich, heavily textured, cream-colored paper. The warm tone acts as the ideal counterpart to the warmth of the red chalk. Greuze is not concerned with creating radiant light effects, but with expressing an emotional and passionate sentimentality. The visual effect achieved by each of these drawings would be considerably dissipated if we imagine how each image would look if it were drawn on each other's paper. But let us now take away the image entirely, and what you have is truly a blank slate. Exactly what each of the 5 works of Robert Rauschenberg's white paintings, 1951, is, each consisting of a different number of white modular panels. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 panel iterations that have completely uninflected, matte, white painted surfaces. The work was a result of a rich interaction between Rauschenberg, shown here, and the composer John Cage, while both were at Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. The school was founded in 1933 and was to have a lasting influence on the development of post-war art, dance, and music in America. It was here that Buckminster Fuller created his first geodesic dome, here where Merce Cunningham founded his dance company, and where John Cage composed some of his most influential compositions. In painting too, Black Mountain had a huge impact for many artists, Rauschenberg among them. Quite simply, in this instance, for Rauschenberg, his primary aim was to create a painting that appeared untouched by human hands, as though it had quite literally simply appeared perfectly formed and absolutely pure. Eradicating any notion of artistic ego, one of the most radical aspects of Rauschenberg's white paintings is that he was entirely indifferent as to who even made them. As far as he was concerned, they did not need to be made by his own hand, but could be as easily made by his friends and his colleagues. Pushing boundaries even further, he also conceived these works as literally remakeable. Rauschenberg viewed them primarily as a concept and allowed for the artworks themselves to be repainted and even refabricated from scratch, all again without necessarily the touch of his own hand. Many of Rauschenberg's friends and student assistants, including famous artists such as Cy Twombly and Bryce Marden, either repainted or fully refabricated various white paintings at different points in their history. As Rauschenberg stated, "I didn't want their past to be a mark on them." Although such efforts were often undertaken to maintain their pristine surfaces, considered essential to these works, refabrication was also sometimes necessary because Rauschenberg had literally reused some of these canvases as supports for new paintings and works. For John Cage, the paintings were an enduring influence and of huge importance for the development of his own work. Cage referred to the white paintings as, I quote, landing strips for dust, light, and shadows. He saw Rauschenberg's paintings as receptive surfaces that could respond to the immediate world around them. In fact, they reinforced his own beliefs in the importance of silence and incidental ambient sound, and led perhaps to his most famous work, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The score having an uncanny parallel to the structure of Rauschenberg's own white paintings, nothing more than the page divided vertically into sections, indicating the 3 movements of the piece. There are no notes. The work was premiered in August 1952 by the pianist David Tudor at the Maverick Concert Hall in Woodstock, New York. And with stopwatch in hand, he sat at the piano and signaled the start of the first movement by simply opening the keyboard cover. Commonly known as Cage's silent piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds at the close of the third movement, the pianist closed the cover, with nary a key being played. The radical gesture in which the performer produced no intentional sound shifted the onus of the performance from the stage to you, the audience, and to the ambient sounds that fill a concert hall. Cage recounted of his first performance, you could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering the roof. And during the third, people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out. And parallel to this, Rauschenberg referred to his own white paintings as one so sensitive to the subtle changes of light and shadow on their surfaces that one could tell what time it was and what the weather was like outside. Ultimately, the power of the white paintings lies in the onus on us, the viewer. What seems the blankest, the most empty, the most colorless, the most white of white works demands our heightened attention. Rauschenberg asks us to slow down, to look more closely and carefully over time, and inspect their mute painted surfaces for subtle shifts in color, light, and texture. For Rauschenberg, it was the absence of color that created the ultimate pure experience. In some respects, this is perhaps the most fitting end to our conversation this morning, but I want to show just one last slide. And I'm going to leave you today with this image of a painting by Barnett Newman. Barnett Newman, famous for his fields of color, paintings with strips, the zips of color placed vertically down them. And what we see here is the big field of red, the field of blue, and a very narrow, it can hardly be seen, but a very narrow yellow strip down the right side. It is one of 4 paintings from the same series that he painted between 1966 and 1970. Remarkably, 2 of those 4 works have been the subject of attacks by vandals in recent years, slashed while on exhibit in their respective museums. One of those vandals did so, claiming the painting was a perversion of the German flag. Exactly why these paintings have prompted such outrage, such fear, is perhaps hard for any of us to fathom. And yet, is it not strangely fitting that the name of these paintings, the paintings that were attacked, is Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? Thank you. I think we have some time for questions, if there are any. Nope. Well, thank you so much for coming. Thanks again.